Now that we know what bourbon is, let's talk about production, or how this stuff is actually made. To make bourbon, we follow some very simple steps.
The grains come into the distillery and then they get milled.
And then we cook those grains under high temperatures to extract the sugars.
They then get cooled down before we pump them into fermenting tanks, where they're mixed with yeast to create basically a beer.
And then double distillation starts with a beer or column still, and then finishes with a clean spirit in a pot still, otherwise known as a doubler.
The spirit off the still isn't bourbon yet because it hasn't been aged. We call it white dog, and this goes into charred barrels for aging. Let's explain what a mash bill is.
Right, so a mash bill is basically the recipe of grains selected by the distiller to create the flavour of the whiskey that they're after. Grains are cooked under high temperatures and then cooled to extract the sugars from them.
With corn being the most dominant, the other grains are made up with rye or wheat and a little bit of malted barley, which is actually not really for flavour but more for fermentation.
So what you're then left with is two distinct styles of bourbon, one which is a rye mash and one which is a wheated mash.
But that's not the same as sour mash though, is it?
No, it's not, because sour mash actually refers to a process where a portion of the previous fermentation is retained and put into the new one. It's called a nest egg and helps kickstart the next batch.
Then after fermentation comes distillation, and all bourbon is double distilled. The first being in a column still, or what it's called a beer still, and the second in a pot still or a doubler.
Right, and the spirit of the still is called white dog, and this is then entered into the freshly charred oak barrels, ready for the next step, which is aging.
Now aging is where the magic happens, just like my bedroom. Aging and selection are the two key elements to separate the flavour profiles and tastes of all bourbon from the same mash bill, same distillery, same warehouse, even on the same floors, side by side.
It's true. All bourbon gets aged in a standard 200-litre charred oak barrel.
There are levels of charring that are selected by the distiller, which basically means how long they torch the wood for.
The barrels are then filled and they begin their journey by being rolled onto what's called a rick, which stands in a rick house or warehouse.
I know a really good guy that's called rick. The rick is a freestanding structure that houses the barrels, usually standing 3 high on each floor of a warehouse. A warehouse generally has around 7 or 8 floors.
At Buffalo Trace, each warehouse contains between 25 and 40,000 barrels, and the middle floors are known as the sweet spot. Each warehouse has a different effect on the barrels that are aging within.
This is because when the spirit is inside the barrel, it is aging, or in Kentucky they call it breathing. With the warm weather, the spirit expands into the wood, then when it gets cooler, it contracts and pulls out all the colour and flavours. In
the sweet spot, the middle floors, these provide the best kind of balance of flavours.
One thing to remember about aging is the angel share. This is basically the evaporation loss from a barrel due to the temperatures in the warehouse.
To explain that, just picture a barrel being filled right to the top, and in its first year, it loses 10% of its total volume.
7% of that goes straight into the wood because it's thirsty. It's just being burned.
Fact. Then, each year that the barrel ages, it loses 3% through evaporation. That's the angel share.
When I die, I want to be an angel of Kentucky, that's for sure.
So when you break it down, if a bourbon is 10 years old, it's generally lost about 38% of its total volume. That's pretty big investment.
It's a long time to wait, but this is such a critical part. Until the distiller decides the whiskey is ready to bottle, that's where it stays breathing and resting.
And just to paint a picture for you, currently it's reported that there are 4.5 million residents in Kentucky and 5.5 million barrels of bourbon. When I was at Buffalo Trace, they told me that if they stopped making whiskey right now, they'd still have enough to last for the next 20 years.
Not bad, that's a comforting thought, isn't it?
I reckon so.